Here is what almost nobody in the world actually predicted would happen today. For 8 years, experts argued about whether Trump would pull the trigger on Iran. For 8 years. Think tanks published papers about deterrence and red lines and diplomatic off-ramps. For 8 years, the debate was always framed as a question. Will he or won't he? Today, February 28th, 2026, that question has been answered in the most dramatic way possible. The United States and Israel have launched a joint military operation against Iran. Trump went live on social media, calling it massive and ongoing. Netanyahu called it the elimination of an existential threat, and Iran is already firing back ballistic missiles, heading toward Israel, toward US bases in Bahrain, in Kuwait, and Qatar. Airspace is closed across 8 countries. Airlines are grounding flights from Tehran to Dubai to Amman. And the Strait of Hormuz, that 33-kilometer bottleneck that controls 20% of the world's oil supply, is now sitting at the center of the most dangerous moment in Middle Eastern history since 2003. But here is what I want you to understand today. This did not begin this morning. This has been building for 8 years, and the path that led to this specific Saturday in February 2026 is one of the most revealing stories in modern geopolitics, because to understand what just happened, you need to go back to a hotel room in Vienna in 2015 and trace every single decision that brought us to explosions over Tehran today. Let's go back to where this really starts. In 2015, after years of painstaking multilateral diplomacy, the Obama administration, alongside 5 world powers, signed the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Iran agreed to cap its uranium enrichment at 3.67%. It agreed to reduce its centrifuge count by 2/3. It agreed to let international inspectors into its facilities. In exchange, sanctions were lifted and Iran's economy began slowly breathing again. It was not a perfect deal. Iran's missile program was untouched. Its regional proxy network, the Houthis, the Hezbollah, the militias in Iraq, those were all left for another day. But the nuclear program was contained, and that was the core objective. Then in May 2018, Trump tore it up. He called it the worst deal ever signed. He promised his base he would negotiate something stronger: 0 enrichment, 0 missiles, 0 proxies, the complete dismantlement of Iranian ambitions. He reimposed sanctions harder than before under a policy his administration branded maximum pressure. And Iran's response was exactly what analysts at the time predicted it would be. Iran did not capitulate. Iran escalated. By 2019, Iran was enriching at 4.5%. By 2021, it crossed the 20% threshold. By 2022, it reached 60%. By 2025, Iran had accumulated roughly 400 kilograms of uranium, enriched to 60%, one technical step away from weapons-grade material. The International Atomic Energy Agency under Rafael Grossi was sounding alarms every quarter. So, here is the first piece of the puzzle that the media almost never frames clearly. The maximum pressure campaign did not slow the Iranian nuclear program. According to the Institute for Science and International Security, it dramatically accelerated it. Every sanction tightened was matched by another centrifuge spinning. This is not opinion. It is the documented record. Now, before we go further, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments below. Do you think Trump made the right call pulling out of the 2015 nuclear deal, or did that decision ultimately make Iran more dangerous? Write your answer below. I read every comment. Then came June 2025. After months of failed negotiations and escalating rhetoric, Israel launched a 12-day military campaign against Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure. American B-2 bombers joined the strikes. Trump declared that Iran's nuclear facilities had been obliterated, but satellite imagery published by the Associated Press told a different story. Iran was actively rebuilding underground sites near Isfahan, were being reinforced with additional layers of concrete so thick that even America's most advanced bunker-buster munitions, the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, struggled to reach them, according to the Institute for Science and International Security. And Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said publicly on CBS in late 2025, quote, "We have very good missile capabilities, and we are now in a better situation than before the June strikes." That sentence is the central irony of this entire crisis. The strike, designed to set Iran back, had pushed its most critical infrastructure deeper underground, making it harder to destroy, not easier. Iran lost some capabilities in June 2025. It lost air defense systems, it lost surface infrastructure, but it learned from the attack and adapted in real time. So by January 2026, you had this extraordinary paradox forming in parallel. On one hand, the United States was assembling the largest military force in the Middle East in over 2 decades. On January 26th, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group deployed to the Arabian Sea. 14 warships, destroyers, submarines, and a floating airbase with dozens of F-35s and F-18 on deck. 2 weeks later, the Pentagon sent a second carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the largest warship ever built by any human civilization. 100,000 tons of steel, 5,000 sailors, through the Strait of Gibraltar toward the same waters. Military Times confirmed this was the most significant U.S. force posture in the region since 5 carrier groups assembled for the Iraq invasion in 2003. According to the Military Air Tracking Alliance, more than 85 tanker aircraft and 170 cargo planes had landed in the Middle East theater between mid-February and late February 2026 alone. Dozens of F-35s, F-22s, F-15s and F-16s were positioned at bases in Qatar, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. On the other hand, simultaneously, U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff was sitting in a hotel in Geneva negotiating with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, the same Araghchi who has been at the nuclear negotiating table since 2013, over the same core issues: enrichment missiles, sanctions. The same table that existed before the 2015 deal was signed. 2 carriers, 1 negotiating table. That was the situation entering this week. Now let me explain why the Strait of Hormuz matters in a way that actually makes you feel the number. The strait at its narrowest point is 33 kilometers wide. That is roughly the distance from one side of a major city to the other. Through that corridor passes 20 million barrels of oil every single day, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. That represents approximately 20% of global oil supply. In dollar terms, that is roughly $500 billion in annual energy trade moving through a passage so narrow that Iranian coastal artillery can reach both shores simultaneously and by international maritime law. The navigable waters of that strait run through Iranian and Omani territorial waters. Iran does not merely border the strait. Iran has legal claim over the corridor itself. On February 17, 2026, Iran's Revolutionary Guard closed a portion of the strait for live-fire military exercises. Not a war, not a strike, an exercise. And gold jumped over 2% in a single trading session. Shipping insurance rates spiked overnight. Zanetta, the freight pricing platform, warned its clients that high disruption risk had to be permanently priced into Middle East shipping routes going forward. That was a drill. What we are watching today is not a drill. Here is the question that was paralyzing US military planners just 72 hours ago. And I think it is the most important strategic question of this entire crisis. What is the desired end state? A carrier strike group can destroy targets on the ground. It can knock out radar systems. It can crater airfields. It can hit missile storage sites. What it cannot do is govern Iran afterward. Michael O'Hanlon at the Brookings Institution put it directly earlier this month. Any strike that targets Iranian leadership risks a retaliation far more severe than anything Tehran showed restraint about. In June 2025, Ali Vaez at the International Crisis Group was even more precise. He said Iran had reached the conclusion that the only way to break this cycle is to inflict real costs on Americans. No more warning shots, no more symbolic gestures, a genuine response designed to hurt. And the Financial Times, citing Israeli intelligence sources, reported that US planners privately estimated they could sustain a high-intensity air campaign for 4 to 5 days maximum, a week at the outside, before running critically low on precision-guided munitions. That is the hidden vulnerability of the largest armada deployed in 2 decades. The logistics of a sustained campaign against a deeply buried, hardened target set across a country the size of Iran are not favorable. And now that campaign has begun, and those estimates are about to be tested in real time, I want to pause here, because something happened in the last 6 weeks that almost no international outlet covered. Seriously, Iran was not just preparing militarily, it was also collapsing internally. The protest movement that began in late 2025 and exploded in January 2026 became one of the most violent crackdowns in the history of the Islamic Republic. The Iranian government officially acknowledged 3,117 deaths as of January 21st, 2026. The human rights activist news agency, based in the United States, put the figure above 7,000 and assessed the real number to be significantly higher. Trump, in his State of the Union address, cited at least 32,000 deaths, a figure Tehran denied entirely. The Iranian rial collapsed, hitting 16,300 rials to the dollar in a single 24-hour period in February. The head of Iran's Parliamentary Medical Commission revealed publicly that the country had only 1 to 2 months of medical reserves remaining compared to the 6-month minimum. A crisis contingency plan would require a country simultaneously under external military threat, building nuclear infrastructure faster than it was being destroyed, negotiating at Geneva under a deadline, and violently suppressing its own population. That is the human context that the geopolitical debate almost always erases. The families in Tehran, in Isfahan, in Qom, who had nothing to do with centrifuges or carrier groups and were caught between all of it. And those same cities are the ones where explosions were reported this morning. Let me ask you this directly, and I want your honest answer in the comments. Do you think Iran's civilian population is paying the price for decisions made by leaders they never chose? Think about that and write what you believe below. Now here is the layer of this crisis that nobody is discussing loudly enough. This was never purely a nuclear crisis. It was always a crisis about energy and economic architecture. Iran holds the second largest natural gas reserves in the world and the fourth largest proven oil reserves on the planet. If a deal was struck and sanctions lifted, Iranian oil would flood back into global markets, and the countries hosting American aircraft right now, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, those countries know exactly what that would mean for their own market share. The Gulf Arab states wanted Iran's nuclear program eliminated. They absolutely did not want a war that closes the Strait of Hormuz and sends oil prices to $150 a barrel. And they also did not want a normalized Iran competing for their customers in Asia, in Europe, in South America. So the same countries that hosted F-35s and destroyers on their soil were simultaneously sending quiet diplomatic signals to Tehran, asking Iran not to escalate. Qatar's Prime Minister flew to Tehran personally. Turkey and Egypt were working back channels. This is not hypocrisy from Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. This is pure economic calculation. At the highest level, every oil minister in the Gulf was running the same math. A nuclear deal without a war equals bad for their market position. A full-scale war that closes the strait equals catastrophic for everyone, including themselves. The outcome they wanted was pressure without detonation. They did not get it today. Let me now walk you through what actually happened at the Geneva table before today's strikes. The third round of talks concluded on February 27th, just yesterday. U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff sat across from Abbas Araghchi for several hours of indirect negotiations mediated by Oman. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi was present and told reporters there was a clear gap between the two sides on enrichment, but also encouraging signals. What Iran put on the table: reduce enrichment below 5%, dilute the Araghchi himself. The American delegation did not demand zero enrichment during the most recent round. That gap between Washington's public posture and its private negotiating position is not a footnote. It is the story. It reveals that both governments were performing for domestic audiences while feeling each other out behind closed doors. And then this morning, the performance ended and the real operation began. Operation Epic Fury, as the Pentagon named it, launched in the early hours of February 28th. Israeli Defense Forces simultaneously launched what they called a preventative strike under the name Operation Roaring Lion. Explosions were reported in Tehran, Isfahan, Qom Karaj, and Kermanshah. Satellite imagery showed heavy damage to the compound of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who, according to Reuters, had already been evacuated to a secure location. Before the strikes began, Trump went on social media and declared major combat operations are underway. He called on members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to lay down their arms in exchange for immunity and warned that refusal would mean certain death. He explicitly stated that one objective of the operation was regime change. Iran's response came within hours. The Revolutionary Guard announced its first wave of ballistic missile launches targeting Israel and U.S. military installations in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar. Sirens activated. Across Israeli cities, the Iron Dome and Arrow systems began intercepting incoming projectiles. Iraq closed its airspace. The UAE followed. At least 8 countries in the region shut down their skies simultaneously. The Houthis announced they would immediately resume attacks on Red Sea shipping, the Strait of Hormuz. That 33-kilometer corridor, controlling 20% of global oil, is now surrounded by a live war on both of its northern shores. So where does this go? Scenario 1. A rapid and decisive outcome. US and Israeli strikes successfully destroy enough Iranian military and command infrastructure in the first 72 to 96 hours to degrade Iran's ability to retaliate effectively. Internal. Protests accelerate. The regime faces a crisis of survival from both inside and outside. Simultaneously, a negotiated transition or internal collapse becomes possible within weeks. This is the scenario Trump appears to be betting on publicly. Scenario 2. A prolonged attrition war. Iran absorbs the initial strikes, takes heavy losses, but retains enough dispersed missile capability and underground infrastructure to sustain retaliatory pressure for weeks. US precision munition stockpiles run into the constraints that intelligence analysts already flagged. Oil prices spike 15 to 20%, according to Camco Invest projections. The Strait of Hormuz faces partial disruption, sending global shipping costs into unprecedented territory. A regional war draws in proxies from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq, and the end state remains undefined. Scenario 3. Rapid escalation toward a direct nuclear threshold. If Iranian leadership concludes the regime's survival is at stake, all prior deterrence calculations change Iran's nuclear program, partially rebuilt behind meters of reinforced concrete since June 2025, becomes either a last resort card or a burned asset. This is the scenario that keeps every serious strategist awake at night and nobody wants to discuss publicly. Now step back and look at the full arc of this 2015. A nuclear deal is signed after years of diplomatic work. 2018. Trump exits, calling it the worst deal in history, promising to get something better. 2021. Iran is enriching at 20%. 2025. Iran is enriching at 60%. June 2025. Strikes are launched. Iran rebuilds deeper. February 2026. 2 carriers, 14 warships, dozens of strike aircraft deployed to the Gulf. February 27th. 3 rounds of nuclear talks in Geneva. Still no deal. February 28th, 2026. Major combat operations underway. 8 years of maximum pressure. 8 years of sanctions. 8 years of ultimatums. And Iran's nuclear program today is technically more advanced than it was the day Trump tore up the 2015 agreement. The policy designed to prevent Iran from getting closer to a bomb drove it closer to a bomb. And the war designed to eliminate that threat is now being launched against an Iran that has hardened, buried, and dispersed its most critical infrastructure, precisely because it knew this day was coming. That is not analysis, that is the documented record of decisions and their documented consequences. One last question before we close, and this one I want everyone watching to answer, regardless of where you stand politically. Where in the world are you watching this video right now? Drop your country or your city in the comments below, because this story affects every oil-dependent economy on the planet, and I genuinely want to see how far this is reaching. What happens next in the Strait of Hormuz will determine more about the global economy in the next decade than any central bank decision, any trade tariff, or any election outcome. The 33 kilometers of water between Iran and Oman is now the most geopolitically loaded stretch of ocean on Earth. 2 aircraft carriers were not enough to prevent this war. A year of negotiations was not enough to stop it. And the question that was never answered in 8 years of maximum pressure, what does a good outcome actually look like, remains unanswered as missiles are intercepted over Tel Aviv and US bases take fire in the Gulf. This is not just a crisis about nuclear centrifuges. It is a crisis about who writes the rules of the Middle East for the next 30 years, who controls the energy flows, who pays the price. And the answer to that last question, who pays the price, is already being written tonight in apartment buildings in Tehran and in field hospitals in Isfahan and in the homes of Iranian families who never voted for centrifuges and never had a seat at the table in Geneva. This is the whole truth of what is happening today. And it started with a signature in Vienna in 2015 and a torn document in Washington in 2018. If you want to understand the world the way it actually works, not the way it is narrated for you, subscribe and stay close, because what comes next, in the next 72 hours, will reshape this entire region.